Okay, I'm already done. Welcome back to the St. Martin de Porres Project's lecture series on the Bishop's document, Open Wide Our Hearts, and Pope Francis's Fratelli Tutti. Today we will finish up our discussion about Open Wide Our Hearts and the enduring call to love. It's a pastoral letter against racism from the United States Catholic Conference of Catholic Bishops. I'd like to start by asking if there's any comments or questions about our discussion up to this point. Any thoughts that you have, or anything that you would like to clarify? I did just want to reiterate that when I touched on some of the documents last week and some of the actions of the popes and the bishops in the past, that was cursory. It was not exhaustive. It was just to get a sense of where these two documents were coming out from. So it was not meant to be a complete, exhaustive documentary history of what the Church has said on these issues. So just be aware of that. As we ended last week, we talked about how the bishops formed their plan of action around Micah 6:8. You have been told, O mortal, what is good, and what the Lord requires of you, only to do justice, and to love goodness, and to walk humbly with our God. So the rest of the document is split into three sections according to those things that I've highlighted. There's a section on do justice, a section on love goodness, and a section on walk humbly with your God. Do justice. God created mankind in his image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. That's from Genesis, right at the beginning, chapter 1. And so the bishops talk a little bit about justice and rights. It says that a just nation recognizes and respects the legitimate rights of individuals and peoples. And then it talks about how the rights are grounded in the dignity of being created by God. And so that opening quote from Genesis is the grounding of justice for humans. Okay? They have a certain dignity because they were created by God, and that dignity requires a certain level of justice, a certain way of being acted towards. Because we're made in the image and likeness of God, and God is triune, Father, Son, and Spirit, that means we too are communal. So part of who we are as human beings is a part of a community. And that reality plays into our notion of justice and rights. So what happens is, because we are communal, our personal identity matures through authentic interpersonal relationships. We discover who we are, and in a certain sense are formed into who we are because of our interaction with other people, because of the reality that we are part of a community. And so a right relationship with God, with others, with one another, I think that's supposed to say one another, and with creation is having those right relationships is what justice is made up of. Justice consists of right relationships with God, with others, and with creation. Any questions about the idea of justice and rights that we are dealing with? Sin. So, sin enters into this creation that God has made and these right relationships. And justice, these right relationships, are overtaken by selfish desires because sin enters into the world, it enters into the human existence, it enters into human relationship, into the human community. We became inclined to sin. As we're really originally made, we're inclined to be in right relationship. We're inclined to justice. We're inclined to grace, a life of grace. But when sin is brought into the world, we become inclined to sin. That's what the church talks about in terms of original sin. Is that because there's sin in the world, because others have sinned before us, our nature, our human nature has been corrupted, and we are now inclined to sin, not to grace. And so relationships become guided by a lust to dominate. Okay? Really sort of driven by fear. We become insecure because of sin and because of fear, and therefore, we want to control our situation. We want to control other people. We don't want to be harmed further. And so we have this lust to dominate and to be in control, to put ourselves really in place of God. That's what pride is that desire to do what God's supposed to be doing and control other people, and dominate other people. And so racism is a particular manifestation of this lust to dominate, a lust to control other people and protect my position. And, out of a feeling of inferiority, trying to assert my superiority. Any questions about the role of sin? And so, where are we in terms of the United States and racism? We've seen progress, the bishops recognize that we've seen progress in terms of civil law, but societal racism continues, even though it's not formalized most of the time in law, saying that these people are inferior, these people are explicitly excluded because of race. We don't see that, but in reality, the way we act and the way that laws are enforced oftentimes continue that pattern of racism, even though we don't have it formalized in law anymore. And so one of the points that the bishops point out is that the institutional racism that we see in our society, the discrimination in housing, the mass incarceration, and stuff like that, encourages the erosion of the sanctity of life. And they'll say this more explicitly later in the document, but this is the notion that racism is a life issue, and that it contributes to the deterioration of the respect for people that leads to things like abortion, leads to things like the death penalty, leads to things like war, leads to things like euthanasia, all poverty, all these things that degrade life and destroy life are more likely to happen because of racism and this institutional racism. And so our failure to address the history of racism ignores the harm that's been done, ignores the need for atonement and reconciliation, and ignores the neglect of the underside of our history. Oftentimes we've papered over, the real costs connected to manifest destiny, the real costs connected to slavery, the real costs connected to Jim Crow. There are wounds there that haven't been addressed, haven't been recognized oftentimes, and haven't been atoned for. And so the reconciliation hasn't taken place, and the harm continues to happen because we haven't been forthright about that harm that has been done. They emphasize that some institutions and laws still deny justice and equal access. The current situation that we're in does not meet the standard of justice, that those right relationships with God, with others, and with creation. And the history of judgment, the history of prejudice against many groups, they recognize the history of prejudice against many groups based on ethnicity, race, and religion. They name some of them, the Irish, the Poles, etc. And they recognize the need to recognize and listen to all these stories. But there's three groups in particular that they're going to go into depth. So they're going to talk about three groups in particular, but they also recognize that there are others who have been affected by prejudice based on ethnicity, race, religion. So again, their document is supposed to be any more exhaustive than my presentation last week was. It's pointing us in a certain direction. Any questions about the U.S. and racism? So they talk about the Native American experience, and they're going to talk about the Native American experience, they're going to talk about the Black experience, they're going to talk about the Hispanic experience. And while all three of these have, in certain sense, similar experiences, there's a unique aspect to each one. And so with the Native Americans, we'll see the loss of land, the theft of land from Native Americans is a big part of what happens because of the prejudice against and the racism against Native Americans. With the blacks, we saw slavery and Jim Crow laws. And with the Latinos, with the Hispanics, what we'll find is a disruption of ancient migration patterns. And so what we find with Hispanics in particular is that immigration law and that forming of boundaries and that moving of boundaries disrupts, in a lot of ways, the ancient Hispanic culture. So that's what we're going to see that's unique about those three groups, even though there's a lot of repetition in terms of the harm done with those three groups. So the bishops recognized that when Europeans arrived, there were already many diverse people on the land. This wasn't undiscovered territory, as it's often portrayed as. You know, there were people here, living, cultures thriving when the Europeans came. The interactions between the Native Americans and the Europeans, these interactions were often detrimental to Native peoples. Sometimes intentionally, sometimes unintentionally. Colonial and U.S. policies were often blind to the dignity of Native peoples. They were often violent, and at the very least, at the best, you know, they were paternalistic most of the time. So even when they weren't out and out hostile, they still treated the Native Americans as if they were inferior and needed protection and needed to be shown what the right way was. There were great wounds left oftentimes by this interaction between Europeans and natives. People were killed, imprisoned, enslaved, raped. There was decimation of communities. Many of the tribes of the natives, or at least sections of the tribe, were wiped out or nearly wiped out. There was land theft was a big part of it. The whole idea of manifest destiny. Forced removal, and sort of a word that they didn't say it this way, but I'm coining this word, I guess, de-Indianization. So that, you know, oftentimes when Native children ended up in orphanages, they were trained not to follow their culture, not to speak their language. So the things that were specifically Native were repressed. I think one of the quotes was, you know, kill the Indian in order to save the man. So that notion that, you know, if we can just make them not savages, we can just make them European, then we can tolerate them. We can have them part of our society. So those are some of the wounds that existed. This discrimination against the natives and the effects of those land grabs and stuff like that, these effects continue. We see them still present in Native communities today. We see a near eradication of Native peoples and cultures, and Native communities struggle with poverty, unemployment, inadequate health care, poor schools, exploitation of natural resources, and continuing land disputes. So this is sort of a thumbnail sketch of the Native American experience. Any questions or comments on that?
The artist that painted the murals at the courthouse, I saw that 2 or 3 years ago when he explained them. He said he had so much hostility, the Indians still felt so much hostility back the way they were treated. He finally talked to some people at Mountainville to go into it with him, but he had a very difficult time, he said, because there's still resentment of the way they're treated.
And that's the murals at the courthouse here in town? So there's still a lot of resentment and hostility that people experience. They move then into the African American experience, and they highlight the idea that the African Americans, the So they were treated as basically as cattle, as property, and not as human beings. This is a change in the idea of slavery that we normally saw in ancient times. Slavery is ancient, but this sort of treating slaves specifically as property and not more like indentured servants that eventually, oftentimes in a more ancient slavery, slaves would eventually, they were captured in war, and I'm not downgrading, the reality of that slavery, but they were oftentimes captured in war, served for a period of time as servants, and then were released. Not always the case, but oftentimes the case. This chattel slavery that we see with colonization is really treating the slave as property. They were oftentimes not seen as human, not treated as human. They were seen as beasts. They were treated as beasts, and there was really no idea of them ever being released. And really to the point that their children were born into slavery as well. And so there's this generational slavery. In a certain sense, their breeding was controlled so that you would have that continuation of a slave population. And so they were treated as property, they were beaten, raped, worked to death, there was separation of families, marriages were denigrated in various ways, and oftentimes children were forced to work. So these are some of the things that we see in this chattel slavery. Following slavery, we see, they talk about the time of segregation. Oftentimes we see a continued servitude, even though it wasn't out-and-out slavery. They were still serving the white master. Violence, including lynchings, a whole history of lynchings, extreme poverty, resistance on economic and communal improvements. So when the blacks in their communities wanted to build a library, wanted to build schools and stuff like that, there was oftentimes resistance for them doing those things, those self-improvement type things, from the wider white community. And then denial of participation in the political process. And then we see, again, ongoing issues, ongoing problems with the African American experience. African Americans were thought of as inferior or even subhuman oftentimes. And so we have a result of generations of oppression and abuse. We still see a high level of poverty, difficulty in terms of getting affordable housing, meaningful work, adequate education, and social mobility is not as high among African Americans today. He certainly recognizes that some African Americans, in a certain sense, have made it, but that's not the story for the vast majority of African Americans. And so they would be probably in that school of just because there are some exceptions doesn't undermine the reality of the continuing racism that goes in our society. Any questions about the African American experience?
I know I was born 1970, but all that happened, but it almost seems like things have gotten better, because there's a lot of African Americans that go to college now, and it seems like the ones who aren't making it are the ones who have babies in high school, and the father, a lot of dads having multiple children from a lot of different women, and it's just putting, where does that fall into all this?
And the bishops do recognize that things are better in many ways, but they're pointing out that there's still a ways to go. And certainly there is personal decisions that are part of puts people in situations that they get in. But what the bishops are focusing on is that, beyond those personal decisions, there's also structural issues that need to be dealt with. And we can do, one example is the use of illegal drugs. If you look at the surveys, the use of illegal drugs is fairly consistent across races. They're within a couple of percentage points, whether you're white or whether you're black or whether you're Hispanic. The use of illegal drugs is fairly consistent. But what we see in our justice system is our penitential system is that blacks end up in jail much more often than whites do, even though the behavior is the same across the board. The results of that behavior is greatly different. And that's really what the bishops are trying to address here, is that when, behaviors are the same and outcomes are different, there's an issue there. That's institutional racism. Okay? The bishops would not deny personal morals and personal responsibility, but what they're trying to highlight in this document is, there are things beyond personal choices at work here.
Well, if I could add to that, back in the 80s and 90s during the crack epidemic, we had a war on drugs. When we hit the opioid epidemic in the last 10 years, we had a health crisis.
Right.
And the fact is that crack was predominantly considered to be in the black communities, and opioids are more predominantly seen in the white communities. And so there's this big explanation as to how white people got, how people got hooked on opioids. That's very sympathetic to them, and also, as I said, it becomes a public health crisis as opposed to a criminal justice crisis. And I think that's a perfect example of how we unintentionally or unconsciously look at the two races differently.
Yeah.
Perfect example for the same thing. It's drugs.
So the crack crisis, which was considered a black problem, was treated as a criminal justice issue. The opium problem, which was considered a white problem, was treated as a health issue.
Correct.
So that's another area where you see, a different approach to things based on race. And so that's the type of things that the bishop is trying to point out. Any other questions or comments on this? So they move from the African American experience to the Hispanic experience. And they point out discrimination in housing, employment, healthcare, education, voter registration. They point out that oftentimes Hispanics are called by derogatory names, and there are negative assumptions about Hispanics. We see a large gap in income. There's also not as extensive as with the African Americans, but there are oftentimes a large number of lynchings in the Hispanic experience. Oftentimes, Hispanics in this country are assumed to have entered here legally or be here illegally. And then they oftentimes target immigration raids and mass deportation. And one of the things, that sort of to unpack that idea of the issue in terms of immigration is when before the Europeans got here, and much like in ancient Europe, ancient Middle East, ancient Mediterranean world, even into the Middle Ages, we're talking about primarily an agricultural society, a hunter-gatherer society, oftentimes are what we're talking about. And so instead of having set boundaries on the land like we do with nation states, we had agricultural land or hunting lands that with sort of urban centers, controlled from urban centers. And so it wasn't so much, this territory against this territory, but this city with its agricultural land against this city with their agricultural lands. That's where conflicts and wars were. They were trying to control resources, not land necessarily. So what you saw in the southwestern part of the United States, into Mexico, is this series of migrations back and forth. Particularly with the hunter-gatherers, they were following the crops, they were following the herds, and so there would be a lot of migration, there would be a lot of movement. They weren't set, they didn't have set boundaries necessarily. So when the Europeans came in and started drawing boundaries, they have set these migration policies, these migration patterns that had been part of the ancient experience of the native cultures. And to a certain extent, we're still seeing that today, is that people looking for work, looking for sustenance, and have an ancient history of migration, are that where they want to migrate in order to work or in order to get sustenance is being disrupted by boundaries that are really based on the accidents of war, of the accidents of history, whether it's slavery, politics, or wars. And so that's part of what we're dealing with in terms of migration, deportation, in terms of the Hispanic experience. The bishops didn't go into that, but that's just a little free little add-on that I throw in there. Any questions or comments about the Hispanic experience?
Seems like that Congress doesn't want to touch that issue, that they don't want to come up with a plan. They want laws that say they're illegal, but a lot of people want them to have legal status. But then they say you have to get their 10-year experience or more to get your.
Yeah, we could go into a whole another session just on immigration issues. One of the things, a lot of people say, why don't the Hispanics just follow the legal immigration process? Well, the quotas we have in the United States for people from Latin America, if they got in line, that line can be 10, 15, even 20 years long. So until we get better doors, we're going to have leaky walls in our country. So part of the problem is our fundamental understanding of what we need as a country in terms of immigration. We could not have had the expansion we had in the late 90s without illegal immigrants working in our country, because our working population would have been so thin and costs for employees would have been so high that it would have led to inflation, and we would not have been able to sustain that growth in the late 90s that we had without illegal immigration, unless we actually made doors good enough that the workers that we needed in our economy at that point could have gotten in. So there's a whole problem. We could go on about that. So we can get sidetracked if you let me start on that. So I better stop. And I think this slide is just highlighting some of the things I talked about already. So let's go to. So the next section is love goodness. He is expiation for our sins, and not for our sins only, but for those of the whole world. So Jesus wasn't just a Jewish Savior, just a Christian Savior. He was meant to redeem the whole world. Okay? So that gospel message of redemption, is not limited to a select few, but is really meant for all. And so in this section, one of the things that the bishops mentioned is the need for an examination of conscience. Are we prejudiced? Are we racist? Even if not in our whole life, at least in a part of our life, is there something that we think about in a way that denigrates another race or tries to lift our race up as superior? Do we need to look at ourselves seriously, look at ourselves truthfully and seriously about what my actions, what my thoughts, what my words are. And is there something in me that is prejudiced or even racist? Do we love others? Because that's really sort of the key. Do we treat other people as human? Or is our first impulse revulsion or fear? Do we love? Do we love others? Do we see the fruit of the Spirit active in our attitudes about grace? And you don't know what the fruits of the Spirit are, you can go to Paul or you can go to the Catechism and look them up. Gentleness, kindness, love. I don't know all the rest of them off my head. I always have to look those up. But those fruits active in our attitudes about race and our interaction with others? If they're not, then are we being guided by the Spirit in terms of race? And do we think in terms of them and us? Are we splitting people up and talking about them and us? Them and us is an opposition oftentimes. And so if we're thinking in terms of them and us, there might be an underlying racist attitude there. So they challenge us to examine our consciences, and be truthful about that, and not just fall into the patterns, accept the patterns that we've always lived by or thought by. Bishops say that Christ is the remedy. And those two great commandments, love God and love neighbor, are going to direct us on the right path in terms of these issues. Do we make room in our hearts for others? Christ is the one who healed all divisions. So are we living according to Christ's heart? Christ died for all. The love of Christ, if we have that love of Christ in our hearts, that love of Christ impels us to see others as our brothers and sisters. And if we're not seeing others as our brothers and sisters, then are we keeping Christ's love out of our hearts? If one part suffer, all parts suffer with it. If one of our brothers and sisters are being harmed by institutional racism, then it harms us all. These aren't isolated incidences. We're less as a society, we're less as a people, we're less as a country if some of our people are being harmed by institutional racism. Love requires justice. We can't just say that we love people. If we love people, we're going to want justice for them. We're going to want to desire that and work towards that. And then in the section called Urgent Call to Love, they highlight two Americans, Father Augustus Tolton and Mother Catherine Drexel. Father Augustine, despite much prejudice against him, he wasn't able to go to seminary in the United States. He had to go to Rome to become a priest. And then he got back here, he suffered prejudice even at the hands of his brother priests. He talks about his experience and how he persevered. And then Mother Catherine Drexel and her talked about Mother Catherine Drexel and her experience of helping the natives and African Americans in her mission. So any questions about that section on love goodness? Comments? Walk humbly with God. With God, all things are possible. So in this section, the bishops commit themselves to certain direct and deliberate steps. Acknowledging sins, being open to encounter and new relationships, resolving to work for justice, educating ourselves, working in our churches, changing structures, conversion of all, and a commitment to life. In the section acknowledging sins, they point out Dum Diversas, a 1452 papal bull from Nicholas V, Pope Nicholas V. In this bull, he granted permission to the kings of Spain and Portugal, granted them permission to buy and sell Africans. And many see this as the groundwork for the African slave trade between Africa and the New World. So that was sort of a big sin on the part of the church, authorizing that. It recognizes that American religious leaders oftentimes failed to oppose slavery and even owned slaves themselves, even up to the level of bishops. Oftentimes, the church interaction with non-Europeans was paternalistic, and religious attitudes oftentimes blocked or deterred the formation of an indigenous clergy. And so oftentimes we see this, we still have that problem in Latin America. It's part of the issue. Oftentimes they don't have enough clergy in Latin America because the European elites dissuaded natives of those lands from entering into the priesthood. And that's something that continues to be a mindset and has been hard to overcome. In our own countries, we saw segregation of parishes, whether it was actually separate parishes for blacks and whites, or within churches, blacks had to sit in the back and couldn't receive communion until after all the whites had received communion. And then oftentimes we see silence in the face of violence or injustice. So these are some of the past transgressions, past sins we saw within the church that the bishops acknowledge. Being open to encountering new relationships. It talks about an encounter with Christ, and that with an encounter with Christ, we are driven to encounter others. It particularly encourages looking at the peripheries, places that we don't necessarily look all the time. Reaching out to others, inviting to dialogue, so not just us telling other people what to do, but us listening and discussing and figuring out what the way forward is. Valuing the experience of others, not dismissing and say, well, that was then, this is now, or something like that. But valuing their experience, and then forging authentic relationships. Okay? And the idea of this being open to encountering relationships is a change of hearts, which leads to a change of society. They commit to resolving to work for justice. They have formed an ad hoc committee against racism, which is conducting listening sessions, providing resources and tools, exploring policy initiatives, implementing the vision of this pastoral letter, and facilitating a national dialogue. They encourage that nationally, the Catholic Church should be advocating for equality under the law and for moral budgets. Also, it should be advocating for equality under the, whoops, I did that twice. And it encourages that we should learn from other countries and institutions that have gone through acknowledgement and reconciliation process. I know it particularly mentioned Germany. I really mentioned South Africa, Rwanda. There have already been institutions and countries who have gone through a reconciliation process, and encourages us to learn from that. Locally, it encourages local institutions and parishes to provide opportunities in hiring and contracting, to support struggling parishes and schools organizations. It encourages dioceses and other institutional funds to support struggling parishes, to support families, seniors, and ex-offenders. And then it specifically says that organizations like neo-Nazism and the Ku Klux Klan built on racist ideologies are sinful. And by extension, a Catholic who belongs to these organizations that are built on racist ideologies would be being sinful in being a member of those organizations and participating in their work. They don't say that explicitly, but that's what they mean when they say that.
That could be Planned Parenthood too, because they started their origins for racist.
Yeah, there's definitely a eugenics aspect of Planned Parenthood.
And now all the billionaires, they want to do it too in this world.
They commit to educating ourselves, and they encourage us to visit museums and other institutions that address racism and the history of racism in our country, and also explores the contribution of different races and different cultures in our society. So it's not, it's not just all negative stuff, but, seeing the positive contributions of different ethnicities and cultures and races in our society. It encourages us to participate in days dedicated to peace and justice. That should say clear, not clearing. Clear teaching. We should be clear about our teaching on the origin of all peoples in God, that there aren't separate races, and some races are inferior or superior, but there is one human race who God created. God created all people. It encourages the development of curricula for children, young adults, and religious formation that addresses racism and racist issues. And it encourages families to draw on the diversity of the church in their formation of their children. It commits to working in our churches. It charges priests, deacons, religious brothers, sisters, theologians, lay leaders, parish staff, and all the faithful to work in this area of overcoming racism. It highlights the cultural diversity within the church, particularly when you're talking about the worldwide church. It encourages us to promote the cause for canonization of the first African American saint. There are several possibilities out there. Sister Thea Bowman is one of the ones. I'm not sure about all the others, probably Father Augustus, but it encourages us to promote their cause for canonization. It encourages us to follow, it recognizes that there are parishes out there already that are richly diverse, and encourages us to follow their models. And then it commits the bishops and encourages priests and deacons to preach on the issues of racism. In terms of changing structures, this section in particular encourages ecumenical and inter-religious cooperation on these issues. So it's basically the idea that Catholics don't have to do this on their own, but where there are other people of goodwill working towards a society that doesn't have racism as integrated into its institutions, that encourages us to work with those other groups as well. It talks about the conversion of all. It emphasizes that conversion is done by the power of God. This isn't something we do by ourselves. Shouldn't think about doing it by ourselves, but it's something that we have to rely on God for. God has that power to convert. They look at the example of Paul, who was an enemy of the church that became a great proponent of the church. And so they remind us that there's hope even for the hardest parts, and that we shouldn't give up on anybody or dismiss anybody in our desire for conversion for them. But it also encourages us, ourselves, to have an ever deeper examination of our own consciences. That even as we're looking to change other people's hearts, we still need to be vigilant in our own hearts and make sure that we're paying attention to what's going on within ourselves. And it emphasizes its continuing commitment to life. And it explicitly says in this section that racism is a life issue. It violates the dignity inherent in each person, and it also makes people more vulnerable to the other forms of violence that threaten human life. And so they would see racism as a contributing factor to abortion, to euthanasia, to the death penalty, and these other forms of violence against human life. A great multitude which no one could count, from every nation, race, people, tongue, stand before the throne and before the Lamb. That's the description of heaven in the book of Revelation, the last book of the Bible. That's the vision of heaven. That there are people from every race, nation, people, tongue, standing before the throne of the Lamb. And so our hope for ourselves and for others is that all people experience that saving grace of Christ's cross and resurrection, and we get to be in heaven with them forever. Okay? When we ignore our failure to love our brothers and sisters now and allow racism to be a part of our society, we're acting against the kingdom of God. And we're making that likelihood of us standing in that multitude less. Okay? And so our challenge, the challenge that the bishops have given us, is to work towards making this vision of Revelation, this vision of heaven that the book of Revelation gives us, a reality in our hearts and our minds now, so that now we're preparing ourselves, our community, our world, for the reality of God's kingdom. Any other quick comments or questions? I've got to get over to Matt shortly, so I ran through that last part because I saw we were going down on time. I was losing time. So, but any other clarifications or comments or questions? Okay, thank you all. Next week, Joe will take over, and he'll be talking about the Pope's document, Fratelli Tutti. I do want to mention that in Lent, we are planning on having small group book study, and the basis of that study will be Open Wide Our Hearts and a book called Saints and Social Justice. It goes through different areas, not just racism, but different areas about the church teachings in terms of society and social justice, focusing on the actions of some of the saints through the years in those areas. So we'll be getting more information. I've got 3 people that have said they're interested in leading groups. I've got a couple other maybe on the hook. If any of you would be interested in leading a group, let me know. We can do either in person or online, whatever you're comfortable with. But that will be coming for Lent. Looking at a book study, a small group book study. So if you're interested in either leading a group or being in a group, you can email me, or you can send us a note on Facebook.
What would the books be?
The books are Open Wide Your Hearts, and then Saints and Social Justice by Brandon Voigt, I don't know, V-O-G-T, however you pronounce that. I'm not even sure what language that is. So, once you get past English and Spanish, my pronunciation gets a lot worse. So, okay, thank you all, and we'll see you next week.